Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to share with you my thoughts on the great Seamus Heaney verse translation of that wonderful Anglo-Saxon classic narrative poem, Beowulf. And I also have planned to take part in a tag called Adventurers Assemble. This is a wonderful tag that was created by John at Disquiet and Dragons, and that's certainly a channel I will subscribe to as I load this video later on tonight. And I was tagged for this by Albert the Conjugator. What a fantastic channel name, Albert the Conjugator, wow. And by Pat at Book Chat with Pat. I'm just finding the welcome and the entry into BookTube just so much fun. So, Beowulf. This incredible long narrative poem of around 3,000 lines. It's really interesting, isn't it, that this is a poem that is completely set in the world of Scandinavia, of Northern Europe. It is a Viking literature. It's set completely in Sweden and Denmark and crossing backwards and forwards over the seas. And it is a Viking tale. It's a tale of Viking warriors, great warrior kings of that Viking early medieval world. And it's interesting, isn't it, that this tale, the only version we have of it at least, is written in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English, and not in Old Norse. It really does lead one to speculate, doesn't it, that this is our earliest version of the poem. But like the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's really hard to believe that this great story, this narrative story of Beowulf, it's really hard to believe that it didn't actually begin its life with a long period of oral transmission, of oral storytelling in that mead hall or around the fire. And then it's also very difficult to believe that there were not at some point in history an earlier version perhaps than our Anglo-Saxon version that was maybe written indeed in Old Norse, and unfortunately we've lost it. So much is incomplete, isn't it? In my last video I shared Aristotle's work on the Poetics, and of course we only have one half of his great work on the Poetics. We have what he thought about, his teaching notes, about what he thought on tragedy, but we've lost the whole other half of the Poetics, where he expanded on his ideas around comedy, which was becoming really popular in that later time in Attic theatre, particularly with people like Aristophanes. And we only have the work on tragedy. And this is, I think, a little bit like Beowulf. And even the Anglo-Saxon version, we are so lucky that we even have it. The original manuscript, it was actually only survived in one handwritten manuscript from that early middle medieval period. And this manuscript, now called, of course, the Beowulf manuscript, but it does contain some other poetic and theological fragments as well. But this Beowulf manuscript was in private hands, in private libraries in the United Kingdom for many, many years. And of course, it would only survived in this one copy. If anything had have happened to it, imagine it, the loss. We would have lost this complete narrative majesty from our canon of English literature. And in the 18th century, the Library of Cotton, this aristocrat who at that stage had acquired the manuscript, the Beowulf manuscript, his library caught fire, and many books, many manuscripts were lost in that fire, and Beowulf was only just survived. and it is burnt around its edges, and small fragments, small pieces of the manuscript are actually unreadable as a result of this fire damage. And Cotton, you know, that English aristocrat, he was very good at acquiring things and buying things, but he wasn't very good at looking after things, because after the fire, he made no recompense to look after the manuscript of Beowulf, to look after it, to bring it back to health, to get it treated. And so we're pretty sure some more damage was done to the manuscript as it just sat in that semi-burnt state in his library after things got back to normal and he rebuilt everything again. So we are so lucky that we have the manuscript at all. Fortunately, the manuscript is now housed safely in the British Library in, of course, London. And if you go to the online section of the British Library's website, you can actually look at this manuscript, the original manuscript, and you can read it and see it and all of that sort of thing. So, wow! The internet has brought so much joy and majesty to our lives, hasn't it? But I don't have access to the Old English, or Old Norse for that matter, so I will have to confine my abundance to the Seamus Heaney translation. There have been many translations of Beowulf, including, of course, by the great Tolkien himself. But the Tolkien translation, while it is very accurate, you know, very close to the original meaning of the Anglo-Saxon words, it of course is just a prose translation. Tolkien really wasn't up to doing an alliterative verse translation. I'm sure if he had have thought he was up to it, that's certainly what he would have done. But his translation is a prose translation, and it has none of the majesty, the dramatic, evocative richness that we find in the Seamus Heaney. You know, this is not a free verse translation. This is an attempt to reproduce that wonderful alliterative measure into modern day English. But Heaney, being Heaney, of course, he wasn't enslaved to that alliterative measure. And for Heaney, the number one priority was always the narrative momentum, you know, that sense of rich, evocative drama. So it is an alliterative measure, but he does free it up at times if that's what is needed to make the lines work and to serve that momentum narrative and keep everything moving along nicely. For me, the Seamus Heaney translation is just majestic. The other thing I love about the Heaney translation is that it was dedicated in 1999 when it was very first published, and this is actually a limited, you know, a first edition, hardback first edition, because I was one of those people that was certainly lining up outside bookshops in 1999 to get my hands on this. I was very excited about it. But this wonderful edition in 1999 was dedicated, of course, to Ted Hughes, another English poet who I just love. I can't actually believe that Ted Hughes didn't attempt a verse translation of Beowulf himself. It's astounding, actually. I have no explanation as to why he didn't do it himself, because I think it would have been a project he would have, you know, been very drawn to. But fortunately, we have this majestic Seamus Heaney translation. And in his introduction, it's really interesting. In his introduction to this project, Heaney actually makes some references to, you know, he, in his early university career as a young man, he studied some Anglo-Saxon, even Beowulf, and he even speculates in his introduction that some of the measures of alliterative verse, you know, the way a line was creased in that middle with the caesura, that pause, that gap, and on each side of the caesura there were equal stressed syllables, of course, and these stressed syllables were, of course, marked by the use of clever alliteration. So the sonic dimension of this alliterative verse is just beautiful. It is a majestic thing to read out loud and to listen to. So this is just fantastic. And Heaney speculates in his introduction that somehow this alliterative measure of Anglo-Saxon subconsciously almost got into his subconscious, his unconscious brain. And when he looked at some of his earlier poetry in modern English, Heaney can actually hear some of that alliterative measure, that way of alliterative verse, the stresses on each side of a, you know, half-lined crease or pause. It's incredible. It's a wonderful introduction. And I don't know whether you can see it, but this has got, of course, this first edition has this majestic painting by Barry Cook on the cover. It's a beautiful thing. The pages now are starting to yellow a little bit, but it, you know, it's a treasured item for me. I just love Beowulf, and in particular, I love the Seamus Heaney translation of it. That is, for me, head and shoulders above anything else. I've always dreamed that one day I would get to London and, you know, although I've also dreamed about owning my own narrowboat and spending some time exploring the United Kingdom at walking pace on my very own narrowboat. But failing that, I've also always dreamed of one day getting to London and getting to the British Library and seeing things like the original manuscript of the, you know, the original Beowulf manuscript, the chair that Karl Marx sat on to research and write Das Kapital. Oh, the British Library. Oh, it's been one of those things that I've always dreamed I would one day step into. I don't think it's likely to happen. I don't spend my money on travel. I don't travel anywhere really. So for me, the closest I'm ever going to get to experiencing the thrill of actually being in the same room as the original Beowulf manuscript, the closest thing that I'm going to get to that is through the Folio Society. A year or two ago, the Folio Society, they had already done a beautiful edition of Beowulf, but at that time, it was 5 or maybe 10 years ago, and at that stage I didn't have the money for it. You know, I still had children that I was supporting, and I had a busier life and more constraints on my purse. Now all my children have grown up and left home, they're all independent, and I live in this little tiny home with Billy, so I have had a little bit more money for treasures like this. So no, I won't get to London to see the actual original Beowulf manuscript, but I can buy this magnificent Folio Limited Society incredible edition. You know, the book came with this amazing slipcase. You can see it here, it's just astounding, and it opens at the front. It opens, and so the book would be in here, and it comes, of course, I don't know whether you can see the beautiful inlay in here, and then it comes with this beautiful, like I was showing you before with the Lord Dunsany, the King of Elfland's daughter. It comes with this beautiful little majestic print, which I am going to have framed when I can afford it and get it put on my wall, along with the one with by Lord Dunsany, the King of Elfland's daughter. But this is certainly going on my wall. It's really interesting, the artwork. I don't know whether you can see that, but all I can see is a Bronze Age Greek warrior atop the Trojan horse. It's actually almost on wheels, and it's a very stylized picture, a depiction. I love it. But it really does remind me of what I imagine that Trojan horse would have looked like with a Bronze Age warrior astride it. It's very interesting. And then the actual book, the closest thing I will ever get to getting to the British Library, to seeing the actual original manuscript. This incredible, amazing book. I did have some pangs of buying a book with a leather cover, I must admit. I wasn't sure. When I went to Borroloola in the Gulf of Carpentaria in very remote tropical northern Australia, I went there as a vegetarian, and I was very committed through the ethical writings of Bertrand Russell in vegetarianism, that the only ethical way of being in this world. I very quickly, when I got up there and was adopted into Gudanji culture, of course, you know, hunting and the eating of meat was just such an integral part of culture and the experience of culture and of going out bush with Gudanji family. So I went to Borroloola a vegetarian, and I didn't quite come home as one. For me, the priority of being received into the generosity of Gudanji culture was even more important. And, you know, it was a really important part of that expression and reception into culture. So, despite my misgivings about the leather cover, I have bought this. You can see on the cover here, it's just magnificent. And the size of it also, it really does make you feel like you're, it's actually a book that's a little bit unwieldy in the hands to hold and to easily read, although the font is very large, so it's very good for an old fellow like me on his eyes. But all things being equal, this is probably a slightly easier reading experience, particularly if you were mobile, like on a, in a car or on a train or anything like that. That's the version, this is the edition that I would still read in that instance. But at home here, sitting in this chair, with this safely in my lap, being very careful, I can read this, and it is a magnificent experience. As with everything with Folio, it just opens so beautifully. Look at these end papers, just majestic. The size of this thing, it's a little bit unwieldy in the hands, but because of the size, you really do have this conceit that you are dealing with the original Beowulf manuscript from the British Library. It's as close as I will ever get. Here's the beautiful end paper, the beginning here with the signatures. This particular edition from the Folio Society was introduced by Janina Ramirez, and it was illustrated by Clive Hicks Jenkins. And so I've got their signatures. Janina particularly is quite a sort of a YouTube celebrity. I guess, one of those up and coming young female British historians. She does a lot of work, particularly in that medieval type period, looking at saints, the lives of saints, the early Celtic and Anglo-Saxon church, and she's done some beautiful documentaries and interviews and things on YouTube that I just love. So I've really enjoyed having her signature here, I must admit. I'm so lame. Here's the beautiful beginning of the book again. Look at the incredible artworks, the way this book is. The verse translation by Seamus Heaney, introduced by Janina Ramirez and illustrated by Clive Hicks Jenkins. Look at that. My thrill. I'm almost, I don't know whether you can hear the excitement in my voice. I can almost pretend, can't I, that I'm in the British Library. Here's just one double-page spread illustration. Look at that. All the illustrations in this book are in this very highly stylized form, which I just love. And they're all this really blue monochrome set against a black background like this. It really does lead beautifully as a way of looking at the Grendel's mother, and the dragon, the three great monsters that Beowulf confronts in this epic tale. So here, of course, you have you in the cave of Grendel. So you can see Grendel with all the skeletons of all the soldiers he's eaten along the way. It's just a majestic book, this. Absolutely incredible. And I can't talk about a book like this, of course, and talk about all this alliterative measure and how alliterative measure works with the caesure in the middle of every line, so that pause, and on each side of the pause you have these equal stressed lines marked by alliterations. So I need to read you a small section. This comes in the middle of the story. This is after Beowulf's fight with Grendel, after he has killed or murdered Grendel, and this is him recounting his confrontation with Grendel to other people. So in a sense, it's Beowulf boasting. Beowulf, son of Ecgthro, spoke. We have gone through with a glorious endeavour, and been much favoured in this fight we dared against the unknown. Nevertheless, if you could have seen the monster himself, where he lay beaten, I would have been better pleased. My plan was to pounce, pin him down in a tight grip, and grapple him to death, have him panting for life, powerless and clasped in my bare hands, his body in thrall. But I couldn't stop him from slipping my hold. The Lord allowed it. My lock on him wasn't strong enough. He struggled fiercely and broke and ran. Yet he bought his freedom at a high price, for he left his hand and arm and shoulder to show he had been here, a cold comfort for having come here amongst us. For now he won't be long for this world. He has done his worst, but the wound will end him. He is hasped and hooped and hurtling with pain, limping and looped in it like a man outlawed for wickedness. He must await the mighty judgment of God in majesty. Oh, the alliteration is just so naturally lending itself to that rich, dramatic evocativeness, isn't it? The language is just incredible. And I think the alliterative measure really enhances that sense of great drama. The other thing I loved about that small section was you can see how Christian this story is. You know, this story is thoroughly Norse. It is a Viking story, completely set in that world. But in the version that we have, in the Anglo-Saxon, in the Old English, it has definitely been written, it's been transmitted to us, presumably by an Anglo-Saxon, early medieval, middle medieval monk. And the story is thoroughly Christian. So it's a Viking world, but a thoroughly Christian Viking world, which to my ear, again, just really leads me to speculate about what we've lost. You know, the earlier Norse versions of this story, which wouldn't have been Christian, which would have been thoroughly Viking, with relationship to the Norse gods and mythology and that great richness of Norse or Viking culture. So for me, you know, I don't bespeak the Christian elements coming into this story because that's the way we have it. You know, it's a thoroughly Christian Norse world. But it does lead me to speculate on the earlier versions. Here's another incredible artwork, another big double spread artwork again. There's quite a few of these throughout the book. It's just absolutely majestic. The closest I will get to the British Library and the actual Beowulf manuscript. You can see also at the top here you've got the beautiful gold leaf to protect the top from dust, even though it's already got that magnificent slipcase. Oh my goodness. Beowulf. The interesting thing about Beowulf, of course, also is the presentation of the, you know, in fantasy literature, modern fantasy literature has grown out of great medieval romance literature like this, like Beowulf. You know, you've got the dragon, the monster, the great contest. The other interesting thing, though, about this and about how it comes into 20th and 21st century fantasy is you really do have these binary oppositions, don't you, of good and bad, you know, the righteous and the wicked. And in this type of world, the wicked, those who are seen as being suitable, you know, worthy adversaries, they are adversaries because they are, in a sense, born into wickedness. And that wickedness is always manifest in their body. So they are deformed giants, you know, all sorts of things. Whether you're looking at Beowulf or whether you are looking right through to modern day in, for example, the Tolkien universe. And of course, as a 21st century person, we must interrogate this and we must think about it. You know, the presentation of gender in these worlds and the presentation of difference, particularly physical difference, is very problematic. And, you know, I love fantasy literature. I love Anglo-Saxon literature like Beowulf. I'm very, very drawn to Tolkien. You know, my whole reading, writing passion is largely due to my falling in love with Tolkien as a teenager. So Tolkien's always going to be a very important part in my life. But I do need to reflect and interrogate the representation not only of gender, but also of physical difference. And the way physical difference is so often in this world a marker of some type of inner wickedness. And that is unsettling. For example, listen to some of these things. You know, the way Grendel and Grendel's mother are described, you know, in the great world of Beowulf. Grendel's mother, monstrous hell bride, brooded on her wrongs. She was Cain's offspring, misbegotten spirits, banished and accursed. Because in this Christian world, of course, everything goes back to the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. So, you know, that story in the Hebrew Bible of Cain and Abel, the one brother who murders the other, and of course is then banished as a nomad, if you like, to wanderings by God and condemned to be wicked for all eternity. So Grendel and Grendel's mother are Cain's offspring. This thorough Christian way of looking the morality, the right and wrong, the binary oppositions in all of this. You know, it makes for a very dramatic literature, but we do have to think about this, don't we? And interrogate this representation of difference, particularly physical difference. The monster wretched and wrestled him, the hell brute. Grendel's mother, grief-racked and ravenous, desperate for revenge, the hell dam. Huge marauders prowling the moors. You know, this is language that we really do have to interrogate, I think. You know, not to get completely caught up in the sense of evocative, rich drama. We do need to also tune our ear to this representation of gender and difference. One of the interesting things about this warrior culture, of course, is Beowulf at one stage in the play, or the poem also says that it is better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. You know, lines like that mean a lot to me because I have my two brothers who have passed away in accidents 10 weeks apart. And it's interesting, isn't it? In the context of this great warrior culture, I am someone who has not avenged my dear ones at all because I don't have access to that warrior culture. For me, I am simply one who is condemned to indulge myself in mourning. It's interesting looking at that. Beowulf dived into the heaving depths of the lake. Wow. So much of Beowulf. I really see this Beowulf through this, you know, Christian monk who gave us the Anglo-Saxon version of the poem that we have. I can't help but see this as almost straight from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Judges. You know, Beowulf, you know, which is also one interpretation of the meaning of the name, is actually bear. You know, almost like a werebear, a half man, half bear who can go between a shapeshifter, a skin shifter, skin changer, who can go between the bear at night and the man during the day. It's really interesting. But the other way I see Beowulf is he's straight out of the pages of the Hebrew Bible. He's literally a Samson character who, you know, fights wild lions with his bare hands and rips them apart and then drinks the honey, the wild honey from the jaw of the lion once he's destroyed it. You know, Beowulf famously, when he does battle with Grendel and Grendel's mother, he is not armed, and he famously goes to battle against them with his bare hands, or particularly with Grendel. He finds a great axe, an axe from a long deceased giant. And of course the giants who were in this thing, they of course were all wiped out in the flood in this Christian, utterly Christian Norse version of the story. It's just so interesting. It's, and Beowulf on the dragon, listen to this. This is the very old Beowulf at the end of his life when a dragon has come to maraud his territory and he has to go out for one last contest. Beowulf says, I shall be meeting molten venom in the fire he breathes. Wow. And then, of course, the very last image in the version of Beowulf that we have, in Beowulf's funeral pyre, because he kills, of course, the dragon, but in killing the dragon, he also dies of his wounds. As a great warrior should, he dies in combat. And at his funeral pyre, it says at the end of this poem that heaven swallowed the smoke. It's really interesting, isn't it? In the early Christian church, you know, they went through all this theology around what happens to the body after death. And in some instances, the body had to be burned so that in this case, you know, the soul of the departed could rise up and be swallowed up by the heavens. You know, it was almost like a visual sense of the spirit leaving the body, the soul leaving the body and going up to God in smoke. And then, of course, in other ways, you know, it was considered a great sacrilege to be cremated. And the body had to be, of course, buried east-west in the ground. So it's really interesting looking at the early church and different ways of doing things and looking at this theology as it was being developed. It's fascinating. All right. Tag. Adventurers assemble. As I said, this is a tag that was created by John at Disquiet and Dragons, which is a channel I will be definitely subscribing to. I love Disquiet and I especially love dragons. So I think John's channel is going to be fabulous. And I was tagged for this by Albert the Conjugator and by Pat at Book Chat with Pat. They're both fabulous channels, so warm and welcoming and generous. Lovely, lovely booktubers. Alright, this is a pretty small, a pretty short, quick tag, so let's get into it. Adventurers assemble. Nom nom nom. What or who, which companion would you take for the best food on a quest? Well, for me, it would have to be Aragorn or any one of the other rangers of the north, because they are so perfect at getting, you know, plants for bush medicine and bush tucker and for the hunting of animals if you aren't going to be vegetarian again. And of course, I'm good at cooking and cleaning, so I can do my own cooking and cleaning, thank you. But I would really like someone on a quest who would be, you know, an expert as a first Australian would be if I was in their country. I would really want to go with someone, a first Australian if I was here in Australia, or one of the rangers of the north if I was in this world, and I wanted someone to be able to get me bush tucker and bush medicine so that I could then do the cooking and cleaning of it. I know this one. A companion to take with you for the pub quiz. Well, I'm going to take from the world of Lord of the Rings, Meriadoc, Brandybuck and Peregrine Took. I don't think they would know any more than me. I think the three of us would make a totally hopeless pub quiz team, but I think we would be very jovial, and I think we would get, you know, a good quantity of beer insiders, preferably, as they discover in Lord of the Rings, preferably by the pint. So we may not win any pub quizzes and we may not do very well, but I think we'd have a jolly good time and, you know, hopefully be a little bit comical. Maybe if I was with Peregrine Brandybuck and Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took, maybe their joviality would rub off on me and I would be a little more fun to be with as well. Plus, oh my God, I just want to keep saying their names. Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took. Oh, I spent my whole life referring to people as a fool of a took. A great comic line from Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. I just love it. Oh my goodness. All right, keep it safe, keep it secret. Who would you take with you on a quest for loyalty? Well, for me, it has to be Smeagol, doesn't it? Gollum. Has anyone ever been so one-eyed in their commitment to what they consider to be precious? I would take Smeagol. Plus, I think it would be fun, well, challenging anyway, to spend a lot of time with Smeagol and to see if you could somehow ease some of his mental torment and maybe mental illness. I think he needs a good loving hand to take him under their wing and help him. So, yes, I would take Smeagol, the great Gollum. A good companion to have with you on a fight. Well, I'm going to say Hermione Granger. I'm not a great one for cancel culture, so I haven't cancelled J.K. Rowling. I don't love the novels. I think the films are fabulous. I think the novels got too long and too hastily written, too unedited for my liking. And she's interesting. J.K. Rowling has always, for my ear and I, had the opposite problem to C.S. Lewis. You know, C.S. Lewis wrote okay adults, but couldn't write children, particularly girls, to save himself. And I always thought that J.K. Rowling had the opposite problem. She wrote fabulous kids, and the characters, the adult characters that are good, are quite well conceived and written, but her adult baddies are just playground, schoolyard bullies. I can't see, you know, Voldemort, the whole lot of them. They're just like 12-year-old bullies in a playground. No psychological depth or very little. I don't buy into it at all. But as a good companion to take on a fight, yes, Hermione Granger. You know, she's incredibly courageous, but also very smart. So she would know how to help you in a struggle. But, you know, with her brain, I think we would do things with restraint. we would do things and not unnecessarily do harm that wasn't needed to be done. That's the other interesting thing, isn't it, with J.K. Rowling? You know, with the sorting hat, when it was time to put all these people into houses, Hermione Granger was the greatest, or the most knowledgeable, the most brainy wizard or witch of her age. But she was also courageous. So in the world of J.K. Rowling, courage trumps every time the intellect, apparently. Because if she had have had the intellect chosen, she would have, of course, gone to House Ravenclaw, who were the house known for their brains and intelligence. But instead, she was sorted into Gryffindor for courage. And I know Rowling would say she needed to have all three of them in the same house so that they could be in the, you know, the room of their house talking and planning and conceiving things. But I just don't buy it. I think it would have been far more inclusive to have them coming from different houses, and it would have been very easy to allow them to still meet up and to plan what was going on. So I think that's silly. And I think this is partly what's brought J.K. Rowling, to my ear and eye, undone. That she doesn't pride intellect at all. It's always courage with J.K. Rowling. And the life of the mind is really subordinate. And I think that's a problem. It's maybe what's brought her a little bit undone. A good companion in a fight, Hermione Granger, I said that. A non-human companion. Well, of course, I have to go with my Billy Blue. You know that. I'm very predictable. Nothing is predictable. I'm not going anywhere without my Billy Blue. Mind you, of course, I do find it a little bit challenging to ascribe him as my non-human companion, because I really do see Billy as my partner. I really am married to Billy Blue. So I'm not sure I see him as non-human in the way I look at things. Oh my goodness. Anyway, my non-human companion. In my wiser moments, it would have to be every single day of the week. Billy Blue. Yes. So that's that. Adventurers Assemble. That was a fun little quest. Oh boy. This incredible book. Seamus Heaney's just an absolute magician. I love that he's dedicated this project to Ted Hughes and to the memory of Ted Hughes. I love his work. But Seamus Heaney, oh, what a voice, what a writer. I love all of Seamus Heaney's work. I have all his poetry, essays. I've got a few little biographies on Seamus Heaney, you know, the great Nobel Prize winner. But for me, I think pride of place in all of my library, my shelf of Seamus Heaney's work. You know, for me, I think his alliterative verse translation of Beowulf is really number one. I love all his work, but what he's done with this is just majestic. It's a most amazing, amazing narrative poem. If you haven't read Beowulf, I really recommend you do so. And I really recommend you get the Seamus Heaney alliterative verse translation. If you can't read it in the original Anglo-Saxon, this is the way to get access to the story. And for me, I'm just going to keep holding on to this, the closest thing I will ever get to walking into the British Library and seeing the original Beowulf manuscript. Oh boy. So thank you for another lovely, wonderful video. I had a great time doing this, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope to see you again in my next video. Thank you, and bye for now.